back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys are enjoying the whole show so far. We are in the home stretch of today's show, and we are transitioning from kind of this focus on the defensive front to now the secondary, and a player who ESPN clearly sees as the number one player at the cornerback position. And that young man is Pat Surtain. And I definitely feel as if this kind of choice stems from Pat Surtain's ability in kind of a thin Broncos secondary to really emphasize the anomalous traits that he brings. Pat Surtain, in many different situations, can truly rise to the occasion no matter what his team requires of him. And so, when I think about Pat Surtain as a player and I look at the Broncos depth chart, it certainly has lost a lot of pieces over the years. And Pat Surtain was brought in as kind of this guy to revolutionize the cornerback position for this new look Broncos team. And so, I really think that ESPN might be kind of the kings of wishful thinking here for ranking Pat Surtain this highly, but in a secondary that's kind of in transition, I don't necessarily see familiar faces. Jaquan McMillan might be an interesting piece. Caden Stearns, I remember him from Texas, but looking at the secondary, it definitely feels like it is Pat Surtain's kind of kingdom here. And so, I feel as if ESPN are right in a sense, but they might be getting too ahead of themselves. Because how I kind of define a secondary player is if not only is he good, but the whole core around him is good. And Pat Surtain, yes, the Broncos haven't been a solid team on both sides of the football. They haven't played complementary football where both sides are clicking at the same time. So, I really want to see if the Denver Broncos can shock people and get some wins strung together. Can Pat Surtain truly be the leader of that movement, especially in this young, kind of awkward secondary? Because he really is the face of what they do in the secondary and how they play their coverage. And so without further ado, let's jump into what makes Pat Surtain so appealing and controversial to talk about, in a sense. Throughout his career, he's accumulated 238.5 fantasy points. 84.5 was his best season. That was his rookie year, actually. 59 solo tackles last year, 12 pass breakups, and 1 interception. And so, the thing is about Pat Surtain, maybe it's not necessarily the player that he is, but the structure that he's in that really makes me question why ESPN rates him so highly. Because they also included a worrying stat. In 535 coverage snaps, Pat Surtain, as the nearest defender, has allowed a 102.5 passer rating to opposing QBs. Now, you can also blame that on the fact that he's really the only person that opposing defenses worry about, and so when all the pressure's put on him, he eventually has to give in. But that is kind of worrying for someone who's considered a top cornerback and who the defense really is over-reliant on. But let's also consider this kind of 3-4 scheme that the Broncos use, especially now that Sean Payton's in. Denver has always kind of used this softer zone coverage. They've never really been known for man-to-man, which I really believe is what Patrick Surtain really excels at and really is his best skill set. Thus, I feel like there's more potential for this defense to become more lax. And it's not more simple than saying, well, hey, just switch to man because Patrick Surtain will get better. No. Every single player in the secondary has to feel comfortable playing that system. And if they feel as if zone is the best way, then so be it. But when I only look at one interception last year, there's no production for Pat Surtain. And when I look at 102.5 passer rating as the nearest defender, that's another worry. And so, in all reality, when we consider Patrick Surtain and we look at him as a player, do we really believe that he's a guy that, can really sustain being the focal point, the true focal point of the secondary for this much longer? No. And I think that Sean Payton and Broncos DC, I believe Vic Fangio is still there, really have to focus on, really have to bring out. And at the end of the day, it's safe to say that Pat Surtain is a fantastic cornerback. He deserves a top 10 spot. But by putting that much pressure, by ranking him as the number 1 overall cornerback in the entire NFL, definitely seems like a kind of long shot look into what Pat Surtain's best traits are. Because it all will rely upon how Denver sets up, how they ultimately deploy him, and how the secondary improves around him. Because there's no other way that Pat Surtain can play without kind of conceding to these opposing QBs and saying, hey, I'm all alone here in what this defense is doing. Because when I look at the Broncos, they certainly felt like they made strides on defense last year. They certainly feel like a team that could have a shocking year yet again. I'm looking at this front. They have nice pieces. I like their kind of core and the linebackers. I like Cody Barton, another underrated player from Seattle. Alex Singleton, highly underrated as well. Their front, maybe not the best, with Zach Allen and DJ Jones in the interior, but it's certainly something to consider. They certainly felt like towards the latter ends of the season, I feel like they found something. They found a formula that worked for them. And they certainly looked like a defense that had juice to it. But it's all about sustainability. It's all about what works best for what you believe you have. And if the Broncos don't diagnose that, then this secondary could essentially fall apart and crumble when they have one of the better players in the league at the cornerback position. And maybe it doesn't have to stem from the secondary. It stems from the defensive front. Because if you have a good defensive front, passes get interrupted and the secondary gets a little more confident and they make more plays. Maybe it's just about generating that level of pressure where you feel like your secondary doesn't have to be left in the dust. And so, no matter what, the Denver Broncos have to finally find a way to complement Patrick Surtain's best traits, incorporate them into their defensive schemes, and B, make sure that everyone around him, including the defensive front, knows that this secondary really needs pressure in order to feel comfortable about itself. It really needs to rely upon the players in front of them to generate enough pressure so that they are not the ones just left alone, especially Pat Surtain, because eventually he's going to decline as more and more passes come his way. So in terms of IDP, I can sit here and say Pat Surtain comfortably is the guy you should be taking as one of your cornerbacks. But when I look into it, I really think you have to be cautious with him because at the end of the day, who knows with this Denver Broncos secondary. When all is said and done, he definitely has the traits if they just allow him to play complementary football and boost that secondary around him to be one of the premier players. That should just about do it for the segment. Coming up on our last segment, another secondary player making a move to a new home that definitely feels like it needs him at this time. We'll definitely talk about this guy when we come back.